having friendships where the person points out, hey, you're interrupting me, as uncomfortable as I felt in those situations and those conversations, it has helped me so much to think twice about waiting to answer the question. And I think that is such an important skill, being in a world where we do have a lot of virtual communication, because it's easier to kind of like read somebody and make eye contact with them when you guys are face to face. But forget about texting for a minute. When you're on Zoom or something like that with somebody, or when you're on the phone with someone and you can't physically see them, or you don't have that body language the same way you do in person, it is really important to practice not interrupting.
Let's link up with Krysta on the FYX. She's a wellness coach with a focus on mental well-being and physical strength.
What's going on, FYX listeners? Welcome back to our latest episode of the FYX podcast. I'm your host, Krysta Huber. We are moving into the second half of June. I mentioned on last week's episode that I have a few guests lined up for the rest of this month, and we will get there next week. But in the meantime, you guys are stuck with me for another solo episode. I've been breaking down a lot of different things around mindset, living in the moment, learning how to be happy and present with exactly where you are right now. And I'm going to take this week's episode in a slightly different direction and actually talk more about listening and communication. This will also likely be a theme of next week's episode, because I am sitting down with a really awesome guest who's created a company around counseling inside of relationships. But this topic of listening and communicating is always on my mind as a coach, because that's really actually what coaching boils down to. But all relationships boil down to listening and communicating. And I find, and this just could, of course, be like the perspective of my own life and my own experiences, I think there's a lot of talk about communication in the context of romantic relationships, but it's a skill, especially listening, that is important for every relationship you have in your life, personal and professional. And the idea of relationships has really expanded for me over the course of this year because of the work that I've done with my coach, Oliver, who, hint, hint, will be a guest very soon, because I've talked so much from my perspective about what we've done together. I wanted to bring you guys directly into his world, hear it from the source, and I can't wait for that conversation. It's coming very soon. But he's had me think about this idea that technically everything in our lives is relationship, because it's us in relationship to, let's just say, the thing. It could be literally anything: people, ideas, the future, the past, the present, all of it. And as I've examined this for myself, I've also started to have conversations with my friends. As a single female, it is often in the context of romantic relationships, potentially romantic partners. But I also have this conversation with my guy friends too, around the fact that a lot of people are not the best communicators and listeners. And I want to preface the rest of this episode and my little rant here that I by no means consider myself the best of the best when it comes to this. I will say that podcasting, and specifically consistently podcasting, has helped my communication and listening skills tremendously, because, you know, you're 150 something episodes in, week after week, you start to learn how to listen better and really hear what your guest is saying. But, and there's a ton of science behind this too, the hardest part about listening and communicating is the fact that our brains work in a way that we're looking for the relationship we have to the subject matter. And that can make it difficult for us to really hear what the person is actually saying, because we are in our own minds thinking about what we want to say next. And in podcasting in particular, I find myself doing this a lot because I don't plan questions ahead. I like for our conversations to be really organic. I actually don't even plan a whole lot of these solo episodes. Doing this enough now has allowed me to just kind of turn on the mic and riff, which is awesome. But I always have just like a couple of notes if it's for a topic where I really want to make sure I hit on specific points, today being one of them. But sometimes it's just me and whatever comes out. Now, when you're having a conversation with another person, it's only natural for us to think about, okay, what do I want to bring up so that I can understand this, so that's relevant to me? Our brain looks for patterns. It looks for things that are familiar. So it makes perfect sense why we do this. But it also makes us really bad listeners because we're not truly hearing what the other person is saying to us. And you can make the argument that there's probably a distinction between like truly listening versus just hearing what somebody has to say. And we couple this with the way that our brains work with the world of technology and texting and our phones being so present all of the time that it's kind of not necessarily a surprise that people are not the best communicators and that people are not the best listeners. So as I was diving into this with a friend of mine, and you're both reflecting on past relationships that we've been in, what we value inside of those relationships, and that includes friendships too, as well as work and professional relationships, we started talking about like what actually makes somebody a good listener. And one of the biggest things that I found as a coach has everything to do with being neutral and being curious. It is really hard to have a conversation with somebody when they may be on the defense or maybe thinking that you're judging them for the questions that you're asking, when in reality, your goal is to actually just play devil's advocate with them sometimes. And I've definitely learned this the hard way because I very much would consider past versions of myself and still current versions of myself more of that defensive listener. The thing that's humbled me with this is one, entrepreneurship for sure. Working with mentors, having coaches, and just talking to other people who have different life experiences and perspectives from me, some of them being very close relationships and friends in my life, where they just ask me to look at something from a different lens. And it certainly helps when you, the person asking the question, delivers that curiosity in a way, or that question, I should say, in a way that truly is curious. You're coming at it from this like neutral perspective. And that can be as simple as asking the like clarifying questions of like, what do you actually mean by that? For any coaches out there who listen to this, or anybody who is a client working with a coach, this is something for you to think about in the context of the communication you have with somebody who is supporting you at making changes to certain things in your life. And asking clarifying questions has been huge for me in then seeing the types of results that our clients can get. And here's why. When you ask somebody a question without a lot of emotion behind it, or without this tone that may be coming across as, let's say, judgmental, and is truly more reflective, you can do that really well by actually repeating back to the person what you're hearing, saying like, hey, so I'm hearing you're telling me, and let's just use a fitness or nutrition example, that you really struggle on the weekends with making the best food choices that you can because you want to go out and socialize. Is that correct? Asking a question that is so simple, and I think sometimes we skip over it because it seems so simple, can totally change the direction of the rest of the conversation that you're having, how you're able to coach the person, or in the seat of somebody who is a client, how you are able to actually make better decisions about what you need to change or what you desire to change, that you yourself are actually arriving at that decision. There is so much empowerment in the moment of you realizing like, oh, I actually do know how to handle the situation of going out to eat. Maybe I just never thought about it in that context before. And personally, I feel from talking to other coaches, from working with other coaches, and from just practicing coaching, from even mentoring my team of coaches, that is a big differentiator for what makes somebody a really good coach who is working with a client in a way to get him or her to be able to think differently and then therefore actually adopt the behavior change that they're looking to adopt by tracking their food, getting to the gym more consistently, losing the weight, whatever that desired end goal may be. And it's so easy to let your emotions get in the way. And that's why I started off with the word neutrality, because I think there's an importance in recognizing that, like, you're not judging, but you're also not looking to be right. When a client comes to me and says, hey, I don't understand why I'm not seeing the results that I want to see. And I go back and I look at their information and I look at what they've been tracking. I look at how they've been sleeping. I look at how frequently they've been in or out of the gym. I look at their digestion. It would not be helpful for me to sit there and say to them, well, here's what happened. Last weekend, you didn't track any food. The weekend before that, you had like 12 drinks. I'm curious how that fits into your plan. And even that maybe is probably a slightly better way of wording it. And I've only seen you go to the gym from what you're reporting here, like 4 times over the course of the last 14 days. So of course you're not making any progress. That is not coaching, and quite possibly the worst way to encourage somebody to think differently and open their mind to why they may be stuck and why they might not be seeing the results they want to see. And what's awesome is it's just a slight switch in saying, hey, objectively speaking, here is what I'm seeing from you over the course of the last 2 to 3 weeks. Weekends are inconsistent. Training looks like it hasn't been as frequent as we probably know it could be. And I don't even have to give those examples, but if I want to, I certainly can. And then follow up with the question of, based on the performance of these 3 examples I just listed, would you expect to be making progress? And if they say yes, that's on me, because that means that I, as the coach, have yet to educate this person on what truly is required, what the expectations are of their daily habits, their choices, their decisions to get them the results that they're claiming that they want. But most of the time, when I lay it out that way, and when our team lays it out that way, the person's like, oh yeah, you're right. When you put it in that perspective, well, now it makes sense that I'm not necessarily getting to where I want to go. And we think about this in our personal relationships, or we think about this in our work relationships. We have a tendency to not really hear fully what that other person is saying, because deep down, the person who is coming to me and saying, I'm really frustrated, that's what they're trying to say. And sometimes they don't even actually say that. The perfect example of this is the client who tends to be avoidant when their performance is not where it needs to be. And maybe they're skipping their check-in process. They're not communicating with their coach. And so often we get the response of, I don't want to bother you. It's like, you're not bothering me, because this is what I love to do. I could have this conversation all day long. And more importantly, if you were able to get the results that you wanted on your own, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have engaged in this relationship. You would be doing that already by yourself. So why not lean into that support and just say, hey, yeah, things are falling off because of XYZ examples, so that we can have the opportunity to meet you where you are and together come up with a solution that actually fits into the rest of your day, into the rest of your week, into you getting to where you want to go, even if it takes a little bit longer for you to get there, but not necessarily causing you to take 3 steps back. Maybe we're just only inching forward instead of making, leaps and bounds forward. The other piece that's so important is not interrupting. And interrupting is something that I've definitely learned from podcasting, from listening back to podcast episodes that I've done and being like, oh, I should have let this person finish this thought here. But I'm the type of person that does like to jump in and ask a follow-up question, either too quickly or just for me to kind of clarify what they're actually saying. And then that leads into another question. So I kind of get ahead of myself. And having friendships where the person points out, hey, you're interrupting me, as uncomfortable as I felt in those situations and those conversations, it has helped me so much to think twice about waiting to answer the question. And I think that is such an important skill, being in a world where we do have a lot of virtual communication, because it's easier to kind of like read somebody and make eye contact with them when you guys are face to face. But forget about texting for a minute. When you're on Zoom or something like that with somebody, or when you're on the phone with someone and you can't physically see them, or you don't have that body language the same way you do in person, it is really important to practice not interrupting. And for a while in my early podcasting days, when I realized that I had a tendency to do this, I would actually put myself on mute so that I could allow the person to finish their thought completely and let them answer the question that I was asking without following up with too many other questions. And this goes way back to probably like one of the first 20 episodes that we did on the FYX podcast, where I actually had a couple who has a relationship coaching business, and I asked them to dissect my communication. And that was one that they shared with me, that it would benefit me to allow the person to keep going so that we could actually have a deeper conversation by me not asking too many questions at once, but just focusing on the one question at hand. And when you have a topic that you're excited about and you're getting really into it, I know me personally, that's when I'm like rapid fire in my brain, trying to think of all the things that I want to ask them. And I know that's where that comes from, but it's something that I'm very grateful for, having this podcast to push me and stretch my weaknesses and start to think about them in a different way. Another big tip that is extremely helpful when it comes to spotting somebody who is a good listener is actively listening for somebody's feelings. What's their tone? What is the way that what are like some of those adjectives that they're wording? They're using in their wording. My brain is getting ahead of itself right now. Are they frustrated? Are they upset? Are they trying to hold back the fact that they're upset? And when you listen for those feelings, then giving them the space to actually allow them to feel those feelings, versus wanting to be the person who always has a solution ready to go and give them the answer to the problem that they're experiencing. That is a really big one too. And that's something that I've found has come through my own work with Oliver, from some of my own coping mechanisms of not wanting to feel my feelings and instead busy myself with distractions. That could be something like scrolling my phone, or could be going out and just being busy and doing, like, even if it is like something like going on a walk. Sometimes we can overdo those things because we don't want to feel what's actually coming up for us. The same way the person who is being avoidant and not wanting to address like why they might be MIA in some kind of situation, like a coaching situation, we can distract ourselves that way too. And when we actually allow ourselves to just sit with that emotion, and because a lot of people are uncomfortable with that, that's another way to be a good supportive communicator, is to encourage somebody in your life, just be like, hey, it sounds like you're upset about this. Have you let yourself just actually feel that for a minute? And that rolls into asking the best question in the world. And that is the question of, do you want to vent to me, or are you looking for my advice? And I stole this from Mel Robbins, and she probably stole it from somebody else, I believe. I think it was some kind of therapist or something, and giving her advice about her communication with her kids, especially as they become adults. And clarifying this with somebody is so powerful, because when I think about arguments that I get into with people in my life over what I may be sharing with them, it's usually because they're giving me advice that is technically unsolicited, because I did not come out and actually say to them, hey, I want your advice on this. I'm coming to them to vent. So arguably there's an understanding on the other side of like, okay, if this person is wanting to be supportive, their go-to mode for being supportive may be actually giving suggestions on possible solutions to deal with whatever you're venting about. This tends to differ between male and female. Stereotypically, men have a tendency to want to provide the solution and come up with that answer, whereas women prefer to vent more. And so when women are venting and a man provides a suggestion, this can also lead to arguments sometimes. But ultimately, that one question of just saying, what are you looking for? Like, what do you actually need from me right now? It goes back to the whole concept of asking those reflective, clarifying questions. And it is such a powerful one. And from a communication standpoint of how you can work on these and why you can work on these, I think it's also really important to recognize that technology is probably the biggest reason why we struggle with some of this today. One, because there are so many conversations that are happening via text that probably should be happening face to face. And again, going back to the romantic relationship examples, going back to the whole, or getting into the whole dating app world, 9 times out of 10, when I'm having a conversation with a girlfriend about a potential partner, there's screenshots that are going back and forth of what's being said between her and this other person. And sometimes I read them and I'm like, this whole conversation could be so much better if you actually had it in person or if you actually had it over the phone. So, as a way to kind of practice working on that and figuring out what is comfortable for you, kind of a hack or a trick that I've learned that I definitely apply to coaching a lot often is when you get a notification from somebody, not feeling the need to actually answer them right away. If you are a longtime listener of the show, I've been talking about this over the course of this like last 6 months or so. I have put my phone in do not disturb way more frequently in 2024 than I have in any other year. And it's helped me because one, I just don't get the distraction of like actually looking at a notification and being like, oh, what is this thing? But then two, I find that of the notifications that do come through, it allows me to decide like, is this something that's really urgent and do I need to answer it right this second? But also taking my time to realize that just because the message is coming through quickly, there's no obligation for me to be like, I need to answer this right now. And usually if I do answer something quickly, my response isn't as quality as what it could have been if I waited and thought about it a little more. So practicing that pause is another really great way to be a better listener and also like really take in the information that the person is giving you and to just have a less reactive response. Because it then allows you to kind of sit with it, read whatever they're saying, and then take some time to like go through it and decide, how do I want to answer this? How do I want to answer that? Versus just being like, oh, let me tell them the first thing that pops into my head. And listen, sometimes it's not that deep, right? I'm talking about conversations that do require you to think a little bit more about like where the other person is coming from. And again, there's a lot that just gets lost in translation of having the computer screen, the phone, whatever it is between you. And unfortunately, I think it's something that people also hide behind too. It makes it easy to not necessarily say exactly what you might say in person, or things get taken out of context. And that's the big one, is if a friend asks me like, do you think I'm being unreasonable about what I said to my partner or this person or whatever? A lot of times when I'm reading it as the outsider, I'm like, well, the problem is when you texted it, this could have been read like 2 really different ways. And sometimes I don't know the other person that they're talking to. So it's harder for me to like make all these assumptions about, okay, this is how this person's going to interpret it. But usually when you're not getting the response that you were hoping to get, a lot of it just comes down to there being a misunderstanding. And to take that one step further, that misunderstanding can also come from the fact that people are not that honest and they're not upfront with what they actually want or how they actually feel. And this one is a big one when it comes to the romantic relationships, especially in a world of dating app culture, in this environment where people think there's always just another option, a click away, right around the corner before that last date even ends. And it's true, but it's set up this culture of nobody being really clear from the jump of like, hey, I'm actually looking for a long-term relationship, or hey, I'm actually looking for something casual. And whenever I think about the dinner conversations that I'm having with girlfriends where we're kind of breaking down like, oh, what happened with this guy that you were seeing? There was some mismatch, and it's not all on the guy. This is not to say that the guy didn't come forward and be like, hey, I'm only looking for something more casual. A lot of it I see is the female side of it, of not using your voice to express exactly what you want. And probably that's because you're afraid that the person doesn't want the same thing of you. The reality is, if you cut to the chase and you tell the person what you're looking for, because that's truly deep down what you're looking for, you are going to be able to figure out a lot faster, is this for me? Is this aligned? Is this what I want? And this is an innate quality that I think is rooted in a lot of people pleasers, and something that then affects things like your fitness and nutrition, because it gets into like much smaller examples. And one that I think anybody listening to this can relate to is things like choosing what restaurant to go to, or going out to eat, or having the friend who you feel like is pressuring you, let's say, to drink alcohol when you don't really want to do that, or feeling obligated. So many of our clients come to us nervous and like anxious over handling their social life. And one of the first questions I ask them is, hey, you're choosing to go to this restaurant. Is it possible that, like, if you're telling me there's nothing here that you want to eat, could you be the one that makes the suggestion? This is a really big one for anybody who has a corporate job that requires you to travel and you may be entertaining clients. If you have the option to choose to where you want to go, lead with that versus putting the option back on the other person. And a really easy way to do that is to, even if you want to like compromise in some way, pick 3 options and then say to the person, hey, I'm thinking these 3 restaurants. What do you want to choose? Or it can be as small as like, your partner wants to go out to eat and you are saying, hey, like, I don't really want to do that tonight because this isn't necessarily going to be aligned with some of my fat loss goals that I'm working on right now. If you don't feel comfortable enough to say something like that to a person that you spend a ton of time with, to a person that you're committed to, then we got bigger fish to fry. And learning to flex that muscle and operate from a place of, well, this is what works for me, and learning how to be able to do that is such an invaluable skill, and one that we really encourage women inside of the Fitness Fix to practice, because the more you do it, the more natural that becomes. The same way it's been kind of your mode to be like, oh, like, I'll just let other people pick, I'll figure it out. It could even be with like people ordering like appetizers. Like, you don't have to eat the thing if you don't want it. If you're listening to this the day that's live, I went out last weekend with one of my friends. I posted some of the things that we ate on social media. I talked about how I handled the rest of my day, like leading up to knowing that I was going out to eat. I suggested the restaurant to her, and it was a restaurant I've been wanting to go to. And I looked at the menu before I suggested it to her. Now, granted, she also has very similar goals to me, but we talked about splitting some food, and there could have easily been a day. Any other day, I might have been like, hey, I don't want to split this. And I would have had no issue saying that to her. I wouldn't have sat there and been like, oh my gosh, she's going to be worried about the fact that I don't want to split that with her. It's like, no, just practice using your voice, and you can save yourself a lot of overanalyzing, a lot of overthinking. This even shows up in ways around how you might digest your food. And stay with me for a second, because I know that sounds like it might not be connected, but another little client anecdote. Kate and I are working with a client who has had a history of a lot of digestive issues in the past, was getting ready to go on a trip, knew that she'd be eating a bunch of meals out and that her friends like to share food. We had an entire Zoom call planning out how to think about it, what things that she could do to, like, in terms of like what she could bring with her. Does she have access to a grocery store, or is she staying in an Airbnb? Like, getting an understanding of all of the logistics so that we could figure out, can she supplement with bringing her own food? And by the time we got done with the conversation, she was like, I actually feel so much better about this. And it was literally just because we talked about it. And so much of what was making her anxious, that she was building up in her mind, was the fact that in the past, she's always believed that if she goes away for a few days and doesn't, have the ability to control as many things as she can, then she's immediately going to lose progress or take a few steps back. And the first question that I asked her was, do you know that that's 100% true? And where is that story coming from? Do you have evidence from your past that when you have a bunch of meals out, you wind up gaining weight? Because that was the story that was happening inside of her head. And then on top of that, I also asked her, can you give me any evidence of whether you're actually really good at handling the choices that you're making when you're not in control, when you're eating out more? And that was the key question to ask her, because she had the most recent 3 weeks, like for the month of like the second half of May into the first half of June, the last 3-4 weeks of her going out to multiple meals and doing a great job at tracking her food, not seeing any negative changes on the scale. In fact, some reduction on the scale as well. So there's our new story. And learning how to rewrite that story came from a place of me just asking her a few questions of like, well, why is this true for you? Why do you feel like this? Versus me making a statement to her being like, that's not true. Like you can't just sit here and assume that if you are going to go away, then you're immediately not going to get the results that you want. Because that's like not a helpful thing to say in any way. There is no coaching involved in that. And it's not getting to the root of why this person believes this thing, which very likely the thing that they believe is coming from a time in their life that I didn't even know them. So being able to just kind of take it a step further and ask them why. Almost like the best analogy that I can give is like the 2-year-old who just questions everything. That is actually a very effective way to become a better listener, because it starts with asking these really good questions. And I also think it's just important to reflect on the people in your life who may not be serving you in that way and may not be the best listeners in the world, and ask yourself if there are ways for you to communicate with them differently, or maybe even ask yourself if that's a type of relationship that you really want to have. I've definitely learned over the last 4 years that it's okay to have a smaller circle and really prioritize the relationships that because this is a value of mine, can actually go deeper in and have deeper conversations in. But I've also realized that it's very valuable to have different types of friends from different situations in life and from different scenarios. For example, having an online business, it is very helpful to have lots of friends and be a part of a community that includes individuals who are running the same types of businesses and trying to build them, because there's just an inherent ability to relate on a day-to-day basis and understanding our schedules. Just being an entrepreneur in general doesn't even have to be an online business. But there's also a ton of value in having friends who work corporate jobs, who work in completely different industries, and maybe even also have sales backgrounds, but because they sell to a different type of buyer, or they, just have had lots of different jobs. Maybe they're a different age than you. They have life experiences that they're then able to give you insight that just because you haven't experienced that part of your life or haven't looked at something that way because you haven't been in the same situations as them, they're going to be able to bring you a different perspective. And that is hugely valuable too. And then you could have a friend in your life that you're just like I said, it's not that deep and purely just for having some fun, but knowing who to go to for whatever it is that you may be experiencing, whatever kind of mood you're in of who you want to interact with, you also have a personal responsibility in thinking through that too. And then practicing being this better communicator. And to tie it all back to this technology piece one more time, one thing I will leave you with is spending less time on your phone when you are in these situations. Kate and I were talking about this a few weeks back because she went to dinner with some friends from the gym that she works at. And one of her friends at the dinner said, everybody needs to put their phone down. And like, she asked everyone to please put their phone down. And I've heard people do this before where everybody's like, oh, like put your phone in the middle. And then the first person who picks up their phone has to be the person that pays the bill, which I think is kind of like a fun way to do it. But practicing being present with the person that's right in front of you, rather than like having conversation and then picking up your phone and being like, yeah, like you're not actually listening. And I am super guilty of this, because over the last 3 years, I have felt a big pressure to be on my phone from making content on social media, answering Instagram messages, and then of course from communicating with clients. And in a lot of social settings or weekend settings, I may tend to get more messages depending on what's going on. And feeling that pressure of like, oh, I need to answer this person right away has since shifted to, if it's urgent, I can look at it and decide if I need to answer right in that moment. And if it's not urgent, I don't need to answer it in that moment, because the moment that I'm in may be a moment that I'll never get back. And when I think about the conversations and the specific people in my life that I have the best conversations with, the one thing that I find in reflecting on like what all of those people have in common, when I think about the scenarios of the time we've spent together, I feel like my memories with them are me having my phone like literally in my bag or not even sitting on the table at all. And it's and same with them too. And that's then allowed for us to have deeper, more meaningful connection and to really listen to what the other person's saying. And when you have those people in your life, hold on to them really tight. And remember that it's a two-way street in developing that relationship where you're both a good communicator and a good listener. And the absolute best way to get there at being a good one is to continue to practice it, but to also just be totally straightforward and honest about what you want, about what you're looking to get out of a conversation, about where you're emotionally coming from in that conversation. And you'll find that you have better conversations as a result. It's like any skill that we need to practice. And I think it's actually a lot like food too. So many people struggle with food because you have to eat, right? Like you have to eat to survive. Nobody teaches you how to eat. I made a post on this last week that probably could be a whole own other podcast episode. So I'm going to keep that one in my back pocket for now. And you learn how to talk and you learn how to have conversations, but do you really actually learn how to listen? Most of your listening skills and communication skills are being modeled after whatever you observed as a kid. So if you didn't observe the best conversations or the best types of listening skills, well, that's kind of what you got. But that doesn't mean that's something that you have to accept as who you are. The same way you can learn how to eat differently, you can learn how to communicate differently too. And our relationships, our relationship to everything in our lives is 100% a part of our health because it impacts how we feel, how we operate on a day-to-day basis. We as human beings are social beings. So pouring into your relationships is just as much a part of your health and fitness as is exercise, moving your body, getting, staying hydrated, getting your steps in, eating all of your protein. It's a pillar of your health too. And that's why I wanted to cover it today. If you ever need a listening ear, I'm always here. Send me a DM. Would love to hear your thoughts on this topic, and know that over the next couple of episodes, I will be bringing in a few experts on it so we can dive even deeper into it. And I'm excited to see how maybe some of what I've shared in this one evolves over the course of these next few weeks. So with that, as always, from wherever you're listening from, thank you for being here. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.